Hello, and welcome to the Female Finance Collective, where we encourage women to have open and honest conversations about all things money. Today, we're going to dive into savings, and we're going to talk specifically about emergency savings. I know not everybody likes to use the term emergency because it makes it feel like you're planning for something bad to happen. So I call my emergency fund my stockpile. So, whatever it is you like to call your emergency savings, or if you don't have one yet, you can make up a name for whatever it will be called. That's what we want to talk to you about today, like why it's important, how to get one, where to keep that money, and all of that good stuff. So, Marilee, kick us off. Why does it matter? Why is it really important to have this stockpile of money?
So I'll start with saying I call my emergency fund a safety fund. And that's really what I connect with when it comes to having this amount of money set aside. I see it as protecting my peace of mind. It helps me sleep well at night. I feel settled. And an emergency fund, or whatever you call it, is important because it sets that solid foundation for your finances. So, if life throws something unexpected at you, it's not going to end up on a credit card. You have the money set aside to get you through that tough point in time, and it's not going to impact your finances or cause extra debt. So, one of the first things that you'd start with when it comes to an emergency fund is figuring out how much you need. There's lots of schools of thoughts on this one. As financial planners, we have a pretty hefty rule of thumb, and that is somewhere between 3 to 6 months of your expenses is what you would put aside in an emergency fund. So, the math looks like if your basic expenses each month are $3,000, you'd have at least $9,000 in a dedicated emergency fund to get you through things, life challenges that could come along. And that seems like a big number. So, what we wanted to talk about today is how you get started and how you balance an emergency fund with some of the other financial goals that you might have. So, Sybil, what are your thoughts on getting started? If someone is brand new to this, they don't have any savings set aside for emergencies, what's a good point to start with?
I like setting aside little bits of money over longer periods of time, right? It feels very manageable to me to be able to put $1 a day, $2 a day, whatever it might be, which is, $1 a day, $30 a month. Asking myself, can I put $30 a month into a separate savings account that's earmarked for emergencies, um, and then start doing it like anything else. I think we talk about this a lot on the Female Finance Collective podcast, is that we just have to get started, right? And starting at $1 a day, 50 cents a day, starting at something consistently is a huge part of getting started. And it not only builds the habits of it, but your brain and your mind and your mindset can say, I can do this. I can be consistent. Because for me, it doesn't work to be like, okay, here's a big chunk of money. I'm going to put it there. And then in a month later, I'm going to put another big chunk of money. Like my brain, it's too inconsistent for me. I kind of need more of a real consistent process. And so I guess I'm saying just start with what you feel like you can, but get started and then try to stay consistent. It's also interesting to think about, like, if and when, and we'll talk about this more, you have to dip into it. This is not like a one time and done. I would guess for most people, it hasn't been for me, right? I worked towards that 3 to 6 month that is out there as the good goal. But then it's like, how do I know if 3 months is enough or I need 6 months? So it's a constant adjustment. And then if you do need to dip into it for an emergency, you need to refill it, right? And so I like the idea of starting it and contributing to it consistently. And then if you need to use some and do that again, I would use that same strategy. And things like COVID was a time when I kind of had an eye opener of, was like 3 months enough for me? Maybe I need to up it to 4 months. And then I started contributing a little bit more about that. But I wouldn't have been in that mental space had COVID not happened, right? But I did have my 3 months. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is emergency savings is not a one time and done. It is something we actually need to have a plan for. And the easiest way for me to get started is to do little bits at a time and set those goals and meet those goals over time. What about you, Jen?
When I hear that I have to have 3 to 6 months saved up and I have $0 in my savings account or like $35 in there, I'm having a full-blown panic attack, right? Like I'm starting to feel like I'm getting all of those bad messages back in my brain, right? Oh, I'm terrible with money. I'm never going to be able to do this. This is way too hard for me. I'm not smart enough. I've made these terrible choices, right? All of that. So first of all, if you're listening to this and that is what's going through your head, like we're going to stop that now. We're not about shaming ourselves or anyone else in this financial field here. That's not what we're about. And we're going to remember that everyone starts somewhere, right? Mary Lee said this is like our goal. It's not like where we should all start. So no matter where you are, no matter how old you are, any of that, like this is your time to go, okay, this is actually really important. And we're going to talk a little bit more, I think, as we move through this episode about why it's important and how it helps you and what the benefits are. Because I know for some people, you're like, why? I just need this money in my everyday. Like, I don't really need to worry about putting it aside. But the truth is, it would have, when I was in my like credit card debt, overwhelmed, all of that phase. Had I had a stockpile set aside for myself at that point, there would have been many instances where I would not have had to use my credit card because it would have had that money saved up. And so there's like goods and bads to both of it, right? But you really can shift your mindset to like, I'm using this stockpile or my safety fund or whatever you want to call it. I love safety fund, Mary Lee. I'm using that to protect myself in the future, not just myself financially, but also my mental health, my stress level, all my things, right? And sometimes when I can shift my thinking in that way, it makes it easier for me to make those choices. If I'm like, oh yeah, I'm protecting future Jen from having a panic attack when her car breaks down, it's easier for me to dedicate a little bit of money there. It's easier for me to commit to that monthly transfer of money, or like Sybil was saying, that once $1 a day, and then whether you decide to transfer like at the beginning of the month or as soon as you get paid or whatever. I think we should also talk about the best time or best ways to like pay our future selves into that fund. But I don't want anyone to freak out because I was always like, I have to put money in savings, and I would transfer like the tiniest amount of money into my savings account, and I'd be like, okay, and by the end of the month I was transferring that right back into my checking account to pay for who knows what. So it was never something that I could commit to, and never something I really understood the value of. I knew I should be saving, but I didn't really understand why or how or any of that. So I think that the key here is getting started and really just trying to get yourself to that first level. So like, are we all in agreement that like hitting that first like $1,000 in savings is like a really good benchmark? You don't have to think, well, until I have $9,000, I'm not successful at this. That's really not true at all. I think the first $5 is a success, right? You've taken that first step, and like set a level for yourself that you're like, okay, my first goal is to get it to here. And I think $1,000, that would have protected me in so many situations from reaching for my credit card. So financial advisor, Mary Lee brain, and not just like Jen having financial panic attack brain, is like $1,000. Like, is that a good benchmark for people to shoot for first? Or like, what do you think? There's a difference, right, between having this like emergency fund for smaller things and then an emergency fund if like we lose our job or like there's an illness or something bigger, right?
Yeah, no, the getting to $1,000 is a perfect benchmark goal for the first step. And in fact, this topic comes up a lot. So for people that have things like consumer debt, one of their questions is always, well, but I have debt. Wouldn't I save more money by paying down my debt? So often in reality is you get to that first $1,000 and then we revisit debt and have a look at, is that the next priority, or do we keep going with the emergency savings? And often that decision comes from thinking about your life. So, do you have a potential for layoffs or job loss? Do you have any medical issues that could get in the way of being able to work? Do you have people that depend on your income day to day? And, are those costs increasing? Kids going to college? How complex are your finances? So if you have things like a business or a rental property, your finances are more complicated and there's more things that can go wrong in terms of emergencies. So it's really thinking through your big picture life and what emergencies could you potentially have. And typically, an emergency fund is not for things like a car repair, like your routine car maintenance. Those are items that you would consider in your everyday budget. An emergency fund is for things that you can't even really anticipate. So it's not maintenance. It's kind of an unknown and something that catches you by complete surprise. I had this recently with a rental property that I have. An appliance broke. It wasn't supposed to. It was fairly new. And I'm glad I had that emergency fund as a buffer because it was during a month that I just didn't have extra cash flow. So it would have ended up on a credit card. And that's what it helps with. So it sucked. That was, not my favorite thing to have to spend money on an appliance, but I didn't feel as much stress. Like I didn't repeatedly think about it. I wasn't worried about it. It didn't wake me up in the middle of the night. And other emergencies I've had in my life, that has happened. Like I've lost a lot of nights of sleep because something happened and I just didn't have the money to pay for it.
It's really about our well-being of our future selves, right? For that moment when we have to access it. I just also had a moment. My dog ate chocolate candy the day after Halloween, a lot of it. And we ended up in the dog ER, which I'd never experienced before. And $425 later, I felt it. I was like, oh, right in my heart. And I wasn't like crazy stressed because I knew I had that emergency savings, that it would be okay, that I wouldn't have to put on my credit card. So really that empathy and well-being for your future self is why this is such an important thing to consider and figure out how to get yourself to invest what you feel like you can into this emergency savings, because it is our well-being, and it is already hard to deal with an emergency situation, and it's even harder when the finances are going to be really hard to back it up, right? And so that's like the urgency of getting something started if you don't have something started, and continually funding that emergency fund until you're at a comfortable place mentally with your mindset, with your well-being. And it does take prioritizing ourselves first, ladies. It's so hard. I want to provide my kids with the things they want. I want to provide, a good home. I want to do all these things. And it's really hard to put myself first sometimes, but building an emergency savings is putting yourself first. And it's so, so important that we start to prioritize that and we get into a space where we can do that. So if you're needing to pay off debt, you're also putting a little bit into your emergency savings, because that's prioritizing yourself when that emergency comes. We're all unfortunately going to have emergencies at some point in our life that we're going to need to access funds for potentially. And so it's really a mental health thing, isn't it? It's really a feeling secure and safe account, I guess, for lack of a better word. Yeah.
So where do you put it? Where would you recommend keeping it? So we have some invested that's more like long term, invested in more like less risky things that, if we were out of work longer term, things that we could like move money from. But that shorter term money that you would want to access, I'm assuming we would want to access it really quickly, right? So we have ours in a high yield savings account, and I think we're at like 4.2% interest or something like that. And it's not the same account that we have our regular money in. It's not our checking account. It's an online bank that we use. We have apps on our phone. We can access it through a website. That's where we keep ours. So that, and then also the not sponsored, but we happen to use Ally as one of our accounts. And I really I at first I just we just transferred the money there. We had an old account there, so we already had like logins and stuff. So we were like, we might as well just use this. And what I learned about the Ally account, and I'm sure there are others like this, is they actually have buckets on there, and you can go through and click like, I want to label 20% of this for whatever. I want to label 30% of it for this. So we took our savings and I was like, some of this is for home repairs that we've already been planning on. Some of this was saved for vacation. Some of it is that stockpile, that like emergency money. And so I like clicked the buckets and told it which percentages I want, and it like broke it apart for me. And so I was a huge fan of that because it kind of did that for me automatically, because I do think sometimes when we put all of our money into one place, it's hard to remember what it's for, right? How much was for which thing. So I feel like a high yield savings account is a good option.
It's a great solution. So in Canada, we call it high interest savings account, but same thing. It's great because the money you put in, it's not going to move around. There's no volatility to it. You receive some interest, and it's best if it's separated from your everyday banking spot, because it gives your brain the guideline that this is to be used for an emergency. So like a fire extinguisher, you're using it in case of emergency. And keeping it at a separate spot helps. We also have some financial institutions like Wealthsimple and EQ Bank that do the categorization, and you're able to name your account, and it definitely helps to have a name on the account, especially if you have a partner, if you're married, because then you can both see what the purpose of that account is. Typically when I work with clients, I always find that one person wants more safety with their finances. They want to feel secure, and being able to see that you have this fund for, the emergency that comes along provides a lot of comfort, specifically for that person that might have a bit more financial anxiety. I am that person. I like to know the purpose of my money. And so definitely having it separate account away from regular banking in something that is not going to move around, pays you a bit of interest, is the best way. So the next kind of thought to consider is, you have this emergency, you dip into your account, then what happens next?
Sure. I was just thinking about what you ladies were saying about buckets and where we have it and all of that, and what like my situation is. And so I definitely have a majority. Right now I'm at 3 months for my emergency savings, and a majority of that is in a totally separate account in Vanguard, where my other investment accounts, but it's not invested into any stocks. It's sitting in what they call the money market account. It's cash. And so an important thing for me is that's completely separate. It's only emergency savings. I don't allow myself to dip into it. I think there's that discipline. Once you've had the discipline to build it, you got to have the discipline to not go into it unless it's something you feel is that emergency or comfort with, right? It's so highly personable. We can't say you should dip in here, but you shouldn't here. Like that is going to be different for everyone. But that part of my fund is really, in my mind, 100% emergency. I'm not dipping into it at all unless I can have this unforeseeable emergency. That's not my $425 vet, right? I'm not dipping into that for that. So I have that, and that has a good high interest rate at it, yet I can transfer it out and it will go to my checking account within like 2 days. So it's liquid. It's not going to lose money, but it has a high interest rate compared to a normal savings account. You guys, normal savings accounts have no interest. It's like 0.02 or something. You make like 20 cents on $1,000. I don't even know what it is, but it's really important to understand that a normal savings account makes no interest. Very, very little. I shouldn't say no because it makes some, but it's so tiny, right? And then I have some of that emergency savings over in a high yield savings account that makes a little bit less interest than my other one. But I look at that like for this $425 emergency, if I don't have that cash flow this month, which it might be my situation this month, then I can dip out of that. And then in my mind, I know exactly how much that is. And I'm making sure if I use that for my 425 instead of putting on a credit card and not paying it, I have to up that 425 again. And so I would go back to my strategy of $1 a day or 30 a month or six, whatever I feel like I could afford, right? I'm also, so that kind of thinking is like how and where I do it, but it's all about like our own mindset of what is an emergency and what kind of discipline will I need to have to access that money. And so then what account makes sense for me? What kind of account makes sense for me to have it in? But all of these kinds of accounts, it's important for us to know are cash. They're not invested in the stock market that could lose money, right? That's not an emergency fund in the end, because when you go to need it, it might not be worth what you put in there, right? So it has to be a secure account that's not going to lose money. But like we've been talking about, having that separate intentionally helps with the discipline of accessing it or dipping into it or not.
I wanted to add one kind of important point when it comes to your emergency fund is, there's all these guidelines in place. You set your target amount and you're working towards that emergency fund, and that's going to look very different for everyone. It's based on your expenses, but also your comfort level. So some people need a larger emergency fund because that is what helps them feel secure. But life is not a fixed timeline. So things will change. And, it's something that you're going to need to revisit. So I look at mine, kind of every quarter, I look at where I'm at, what I think is going to happen in the months ahead. My income is highly variable, so I need to do that. If you have a fixed salary, it's a little easier to calculate and figure out what your emergency fund needs to do. But life changes, and it's one of these things where you have some parameters in place, but you need to check in on it on a regular basis. I also wanted to mention a few outlier situations. So one is often people will say, well, I'm just going to keep my emergency fund. I'm just going to have a line of credit and I'll use that instead. And the problem with that is when we went through these rate increases with that scenario, suddenly, lines of credit weren't a few percent. They were, 12, 13, 14%. And then, using that strategy, you ended up paying a lot of interest if you had an emergency fund at that time. The other outlier scenario is sometimes people keep a lot of money in their emergency fund and they don't have any longer term savings. So it's, they're keeping a large amount of cash just set aside for emergencies. And it may be more than, kind of any emergency that they could come across. So those are the two outlier situations just to think about and see if they apply to your finances and kind of, what you think about in terms of emergency fund planning.
There's like so much to think about, but I think that it really just boils down to simple things, right? Commit to doing this, decide where you're going to put it, start small. If you have a bunch of money every month and you're like, I could actually put aside a whole bunch and like kind of get this set up in a few months, great. If you don't, and you're kind of in that paycheck to paycheck situation, then, choose a small amount that you can commit to, take $10 out of your monthly grocery budget and like transfer that over. You can figure this out. You can absolutely do it. Just take it one step at a time. We might have talked about it with a lot of different like aspects to consider, but the number one thing is to just get started. Pick the place that you want to put the money and keep it, and then start transferring it over, right? And just prioritize it. Remind yourself that this is a kind of a gift that you're giving to future you. And if you never need it, surprise, you're going to have this big chunk of money later, like, that you can decide what you want to do with. You can invest some of it for your retirement or whatever it is. But it will always feel good to have this set aside in case something does come up. We can't plan emergencies. Wouldn't that be amazing if we could? But we can't plan for those things. So if we can prepare in case they happen, it just makes everything so much smoother and so much easier. So thank you very much for listening to this episode all about that kind of emergency savings stockpile. We really appreciate you being here. If you want, you can find us on YouTube and also Instagram. Instagram's femalefinance.collective, but we're Female Finance Collective everywhere else. So if you have any questions or topic ideas, we would love to hear from you. Be sure to leave us a comment and review. We would love that as well. Have a good one.